you sell someone on the American dream, right? Which for a long time was a way to kind of keep the public down a little bit. Say like, listen, it's up to you to bring yourself up by your own britches, period. And then you attach materialism to that American dream, and you sell people on this idea of like, all right, well, here's what success means. It means all these things, these items that all depreciate in value. It doesn't mean owning stuff. It means having possessions that depreciate in value. Well, how are you going to get those? Well, we're going to lend you money to get it, right? So you get this consumer culture that becomes a debt culture, and then, if you want to squeeze the middle class out and squeeze wealth to the top, what you do is you make money really cheap. You have a bunch of people take on debt, and then that debt system collapses. You have massive inflation. They effectively lose everything, which allows corporations to thrive. And then in that environment, you're like, don't worry, Big Brother will take care of you. And Big Brother's in the form of a huge corporation that can provide things for cheaper than your local provider, and everyone's happy for a little while. But then you get this sort of situation where people realize, oh my gosh, like I'm kind of stuck in servitude to these big corporations. And then I think you combine that with like, all right, well, someone's going to catch on to this, and it's probably going to be people who are maybe like highly educated. So what happens if all these people go get an education? They look around and say, well, this is some bullshit that's going on here. Well, one way to shut those people up is to bury them in debt. Right. So you've got these universities that have so much money and so much influence, and have so much influence upon them that can, sort of dictate what people are learning on the one hand, but also can bury them in debt because they are the gatekeepers to any sort of prosperity in the Western world. So if you bury them in debt, there's not really that much that they can do to you. In fact, they will, if anything, work harder for you to get themselves out of debt, and they will be thankful for the job at the same multinational corporation that has maybe put them in this position to begin with. Yeah, that's my little tirade. That's how it all loops together.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just back on my random shit. Is it so bad though that we did it this way? Like, you look at countries that didn't go after the capitalistic style, and they've stayed very.
I'm so glad you mentioned this.
I would say like a lot of them are third world, and like a lot of them. But it's weird. Like I've traveled some of these places, and you know what the people.
We're gonna get killed on the terminology here because I don't think you're allowed to call places third worlds anymore.
Yeah, I'll get executed. I get executed consistently on this, but like, basically these countries that haven't chased this concept of the American dream, haven't gone after the whole capitalistic society, like they live a lower standard of life often, like most of the time. Like they just don't have all the things that we have. But on the flip side, I'll say whenever I'm there, I always ask the people if they're happy, and they always say totally. And I'm like, do you want more? And like, no, I don't. And I'm like, have you been to the States or Canada? Yep. Do you want to go back? No.
Yeah. So there's a couple things, man, there's so much in there to unpack. This is this weird conundrum that no one that's like pro, we need to do this great reset. We need sustainability. We need to, hammer the oil industry, blah, 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 blah. Like, if that's what you want, realize that those developing countries will never develop. They will have no chance. Because if we're saying they can't have petroleum-based products, then they will never have our standard of life. Right? Way. So by saying that you are pro this sustainable push, a requirement of that, like it or not, is to keep some of these countries down, to keep them down. Because if, like, we're basically saying that we don't want them to have cars, we don't want them to have anything petroleum based, we want to limit their access to, the main microchips that drive our world these days. Mm-hmm. Like, you are saying that, we can still get to enjoy them. Like, we've got our cars, we got our chips, we got everything we need, so we're good. We're going to try to do a little better. We're going to put a little more taxes in. Mm-hmm. But these things, we're outlawing them. We're banning them. And these other countries over here are like, well, man, like, we still have dirt roads. Like, you're telling us now that we don't get all those things because now you guys are starting to feel bad, a century later. Yeah. Right? Like, we still want those things. So that's a real conundrum that exists within that movement that no one in that movement seems to want to acknowledge. And then there's just also the fact that, like, is that whole movement utter BS, which is just going to further push inflation, drive up the cost of everything, which, again, does not impact the super wealth. Like, to see Prince Charles up there talking about, like, oh, this is a great time to reset the economy. Like, what's that dude?
Prince Charles.
Like, he hasn't bought a carton of milk ever in his life, right? Like, it doesn't apply to them, and yet they're the ones who are
making the decisions,
but also like trying to influence liberal people. Like, no, this is the right thing to do. Have the moral high ground to do this, this, and this. Yeah, it's going to cost everyone a bit more, but I think we're all going to chip in together. It's BS, man, because they don't care about that bill. But poor people in developing countries, people most at risk, they are going to care about that bill. And countries like, say, Russia, China, to some extent, India, they don't care about some of those things, man. No. And so they're using that to their advantage.
That's why they're growing so fast now.
And even like, it seems like a weird coincidence that while all this is going on, there was also some communication and some attempts by Russia and China to create a new standard currency to get everyone off of reliance on the American dollar. Because when America went through these periods of huge inflation, especially in the 70s and 80s, the only thing that maintained them was that they were still the international currency that was used for oil and all that stuff. That was the only thing that protected their dollar. And so now there's all this inflationary pressure on the American dollar, and China and Russia are trying to pull the rug out from underneath.
They pull that shootout. It's their whole bud.
And, to counter that, the Western world has always produced a narrative about, how evil China is and how evil Russia is. And, like, a lot of people don't fully understand everything that's going in Russia, Ukraine. And we're not geopolitical scientists, so we're not going to touch that too much. But there's a lot of, like, a lot of the reasons Russia is invading Ukraine has to do with controlling resources, oil, wheat, and all the other things that Ukraine has, because there is
Neal.
this sort of alignment of the supply chain. And I think that Russia sees what China has managed to do by just controlling supply. And not surprisingly, they're thinking, yeah, us too. And it's a terrible thing to invade a country like that. But the reason they did it is, not surprisingly, economically motivated, supply motivated.
Totally. Ukraine too. They have the neon supply, which is a global required thing, and they produce like 80% of it. Yeah, I mean, that's not actually neon, but we'll pretend that it is.
Yeah.
When I was broke, I had rich habits. When I was broke, I had rich habits.